HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents How to Be Healthy, an Ancient Guide to Wellness by Galen, translated by Katherine Van Schaik, read by Cindy Kay and Rick Adamson. The health advice contained in this book is intended for historical illumination, and while it may be timely and timeless, it is nonetheless ancient. Please consult your physician before making any drastic changes to your diet and exercise routine, or otherwise attempting to alter your humoral balance. Preface. Galen is a challenging author for inclusion in the Ancient Wisdom series, which asserts, rightfully so, that classical texts provide useful, practical advice for modern listeners. Because so many of Galen's texts are beautifully and cohesively constructed on theories of physiology that we now know to be false. Consequently, the medical reasoning, diagnostic categories, prognoses, and therapeutic recommendations dependent on these theories are ill-advised at best and dangerous at worst. Why, therefore, should we seek wisdom in Galen's long philosophical treatises about the causes of disease, in his recommendations for preventive medicine, or in his meditations on the complex relationship between body and soul? In fact, Galen was a careful physician and a prolix writer, offering some ancient wisdom that we today might consider modern, were it not so old. In choosing texts from the Galenic corpus for this volume, I used the following general guiding principle. I sought advice that a modern Western physician might reasonably give, or at least with which she would not disagree most of the time. This criterion meant that many of Galen's better-known works were excluded on this basis, as the recommendations they offer are not prescribed by today's physicians. Drawing from 9 selections from 8 works, I have aggregated my chosen excerpts into 5 broad categories. 1. The mind-body connection. 2. Exercising the body. 3. Individual physiologies. 4. Nourishing the body. And 5. Definitions of health and disease. Contextual information for these categories is found at the beginning of each section. Texts in the first, second, and fourth sections, the mind-body connection, exercising the body, and nourishing the body, in general more straightforwardly align with my stated selection criterion. These are lively texts that, in many respects, can be practically applied to the life of a modern listener. However, it should be said that there are still some bits of text here and there, within excerpts that are broadly consistent with my theme, that would be objectionable to a modern health provider. For instance, in On Exercise with a Small Ball, Galen's dismissal of running as a suitable form of exercise. Galen and modern physicians were and are working within, to borrow from the arguments of Thomas Kuhn, different paradigms of health and disease. Their views of the human body are, in some ways, fundamentally different and completely incompatible. In this respect, recommendation of any of Galen's texts as an ancient guide to wellness could be considered problematic, as such works were composed on the basis of a theoretical system that physicians no longer use. For the third and fifth sections, individual physiologies and definitions of health and disease, my selection criterion of advice that a modern Western physician might reasonably give, or at least with which she would not disagree, might feel a bit inconsistent with the ideas that are presented. These selections, more philosophical in tone, make for somewhat heavier listening, and I have included them should a listener wish to hear some of the theoretical foundations for the material in the other sections. I still believe that these texts are relevant for modern listeners, as they provide an overview of the sophistication and clarity of Galen's disease classification schemata and have, I believe, a certain contemporary feel when considered in light of the increasing modern tendency of providers to follow diagnostic and therapeutic algorithms. Galen was constructing his diagnostic and therapeutic algorithms, if we may be allowed to use this term here, in an era without advanced laboratory and imaging techniques. But his efforts find parallels in modern endeavors to classify diseases into types and subtypes for the purpose of appropriately tailored treatment. Similarly, his focus on patients' individual constitutions and his emphasis on the necessity of the provider's acknowledgement of such particularities, highlighted in the texts in Section 3, find their modern analog in the developing field of precision medicine. In the process of searching for, finding, and translating these texts, I came to believe even more strongly that excluding Galen from the Ancient Wisdom series because some of his theoretical principles do not match our own would be to deprive ourselves of a long-standing font of ancient wisdom that have served many physicians and laypeople in many cultures over the course of many centuries. Indeed, some of his recommendations, carefully developed from dedicated study, relentless work, and meticulous observation, remain quite sensible, even if we disagree with their theoretical foundations. Galen's close observation of the individual circumstances and physiologies of his patients, his insistence on what we today label with the terms holistic medicine and wellness, and his unwavering commitment to what medical schools now call interdisciplinary medical training remain as inspiring as they ever were. Our deepest loves nourish, enliven, and inspire us, as Galen knew well, and this book is therefore dedicated to James and to Cyrus, with great love and gratitude. Introduction. Galen. I am extremely amazed that, although health is highly valued, men are so remiss as to neglect it. They refrain from seeking instruction in an art by which they will regain health. So the physician Galen begins his short text on the examinations by which the best physicians are recognized, written around 175 CE, to teach his contemporaries how to identify a truly well-qualified physician in a world without diplomas or medical licensing boards. Lamenting that educated men do not study medicine as they used to, he provides what solutions he can to this problem, outlining how someone, lacking in medical knowledge himself, could at least identify a competent physician. The candidate should be well read in the works of his medical predecessors, including but not limited to Hippocrates, Diocles, and Praxagoras, be trained in anatomy and knowledge of the function of each organ, possess an extensive knowledge of pharmacology and dietetics, be skilled in some surgical procedures, although Galen does designate a separate set of questions to be used for interviewing surgeons, and comport himself appropriately. While it would certainly be possible to ask the candidate about these dimensions of his training, Galen writes, it is, of course, preferable to see him in action, successfully treating patients and predicting the course of their disease. Galen was really describing himself and the education that he undertook during more than a decade to become what was surely at the time the Mediterranean world's best trained physician. He started practicing independently in his hometown in his late 20s and did not begin his work in Rome until his early 30s. The duration of his education is analogous to that of modern medical specialists with advanced training and secondary degrees beyond their MD certification. His knowledge, skills, experiences, oeuvre, and ego were of equally great magnitude, and we know about him and his world by dint of his own prolixity. Galen's texts constitute an estimated 10% of all extant Greek literature dating before 350 CE. and we know that we're still missing much of what he wrote. The sheer volume of Galen's writing not only provided foundational principles for Western medical practice, and indeed for much of Islamic medical practice as well, up to the 19th century, but also gives us fascinating opportunities to peer into the daily life and world of a wealthy, well-educated Greek who was born in modern Turkey, traveled extensively, and reached the highest echelons of the Roman Empire as a physician to the imperial family. In the nearly 2 millennia that have passed since Galen treated his own patients, generations of physicians, scholars, and students have gotten to know him in their own ways, focusing on many different aspects of his life and work. I include here a few of the ways that he has been described by more recent biographers and commentators, to provide a sense of the diversity of approaches used in efforts to understand this complicated, talented, and at times insufferable person. Vivian Nutton's 2020 biography is divided into chapters based on Galen's varied identities: Greek, Roman, observer, thinker, doctor, ghost. A chapter dedicated to reception history. Peter Singer's 1997 collection of English translations includes an introduction subdivided into still different identities: philosopher, scholar and anatomist, systematist and inventor, as well as a section on Galen's sophisticated views on the relationship between the body and the soul. Susan Mattern's 2013 biography, The Prince of Medicine, situates Galen's development as a physician within the broader social world of the 2nd century Mediterranean, with a special focus on Galen's relationship with his patients. There are thousands of books and articles about Galen and his works in many languages, with still more being added annually as new manuscripts attributed to him, not only appearing in Greek, but also translated into Latin, Arabic, Armenian, Hebrew, and Syriac, are uncovered in libraries, monasteries, and private collections. Galen therefore defies simple definitions, presenting a challenge to anyone who aims to provide a brief overview of his life and work. This biographical outline, therefore, necessarily overlooks details and elides nuance, but hopefully provides useful background information for the texts included in this book. Likely born in 129 CE in Pergamum, modern Bergama, Turkey, Galen was raised in a wealthy, landed family. The city of Pergamum was cosmopolitan and grand, with connections to Alexandria and Egypt, to other prominent Greek cities, and of course, to Rome. Pergamum was an economic and cultural center in the Roman province of Asia. The city featured one of the Mediterranean's largest shrines to Asclepios, the god of healing, which may very well have influenced the young Galen's aspirations. Galen's father, Nikon, was an architect, and by Galen's own account, a devoted father who personally taught his young son until Galen was about 14. The eager adolescent then began attending lectures given by philosophers who represented a range of commitments to different schools of philosophical thought. Nikon interviewed each of them to determine their depth of knowledge and suitability as a tutor. Nikon's moderation, as Galen describes in his Affections and Errors of the Soul, greatly influenced Galen's own philosophical commitments and attitude toward medicine. He writes that his father's knowledge of geometry, mathematics, architecture, and astronomy led him to emphasize the importance of precision in language and to highlight the philosophical convergence around matters such as geometry and mathematics, even though there was no consensus, as such, on these topics among different philosophical and medical schools of thought. Yet Nikon also cautioned Galen not to adhere to any one philosophical sect, but rather to scrutinize them all, and to subscribe to those views most people acknowledge to be commendable and worthwhile. When Galen was 16, Nikon's dreams instructed him to set his talented and precocious son on a path to study not only philosophy, but also medicine. Nikon subsequently arranged for Galen to accompany at least 4 different physicians as they saw and treated patients in Pergamum. Their backgrounds, training, and intellectual commitments were diverse, and a brief overview of the broad ideological groups to which they belonged will provide insight into Galen's training and contextualize the traditions undergirding his own way of practicing medicine. Scholars often subdivide Greco-Roman medical practitioners of the centuries before and during Galen's lifetime into 3 broad groups. In this, they follow Celsus, an encyclopedist of the first centuries BCE and CE, whose 8 Latin volumes on the topic of medicine, De Medicina, discuss a range of topics, including the extant medical tradition, anatomy, pathophysiology, specific diseases, pharmacology, and surgical intervention. At the outset of his historical overview, Celsus writes that some physicians are committed to investigating hidden causes of disease, believing that proper treatment necessitates knowledge of causality. These physicians were called dogmatists or rationalists, named for their emphasis on the theories of causality. Although the practitioners in this group believed that knowledge of medical theory was crucial for successful diagnoses, treatment, and prognosis, their similarities end here. The theories to which they subscribed were remarkably diverse and generated from centuries of accumulated medical and scientific knowledge and philosophical debate. The second broad group of physicians that Celsus describes were the empiricists, dedicated to a tradition that focused on direct observation. When we today speak of empirical data, we draw on this tradition of reliance on empiria, a preference for allowing direct, lived experience to guide our decision-making. These practitioners were impatient with what they deemed unprovable and unnecessary investigations into the hidden causes of disease, and emphasized the important role of direct experience in medical training. Although they did concede that, given the impossibility of encountering every medical condition in a lifetime, a physician might have recourse to the writings of reliable predecessors in uncertain or newly encountered cases. Galen's teachers in Pergamum fell into and straddled the line between these 2 broad groups of physicians, the rationalists/dogmatists and the empiricists. The third group of physicians that Celsus describes, the Methodists, were also averse to theorizing about etiology. They sorted diseases into 3 broad categories: excessive looseness, excessive constriction, and a mixed state. This medical sect in particular attracted Galen's ire, and its practitioners were often the targets of vitriolic abuse in his texts and public demonstrations. The young Galen's 4 and possibly 5 physician teachers in Pergamum represented a wide range of medical epistemologies. Definitely one teacher, Acreon, and possibly a second, Epicurus, were empiricists, whose perspectives must have deeply influenced Galen's own practice. In his later writings, Galen describes his admiration for the empiricists' careful attention to detail, and he praises their focus on direct experience and repeated observation, including their extensive descriptions of the pulse. Yet he objected to the empiricist stance against deductive and causal reasoning. Galen's own extensive corpus is evidence of his commitment to a theoretical framework that did involve these kinds of reasoning, even as his views on medical training shared the empiricist emphasis on observation and empiria. Galen's additional physician teachers in Pergamum would have been classified as dogmatists/rationalists, although empiricist practices likely influenced them too. One of them, A pneumatist would have seen imbalances in pneuma, breath that was physiologically modified by the heart and brain, as a cause of disease. Satyrus, himself a student of the famous physician Quintus, was an especially important teacher for Galen, and does not seem to have aligned himself with any particular medical sect, although he appears to have taken an empiricist approach to many dimensions of medical education and practice. Bringing the teenage Galen along to treat patients, Satyrus instructed him in anatomy and pharmacology, inspiring his eager pupil to seek out other students of Quintus on the travels he would begin to undertake in his 20s, after his father's death. The practical dimension of Galen's medical education was augmented by his indefatigable commitment to reading as much of the enormous written medical tradition as he could. Like the dedicated pre-medical students in the modern American university, Galen matter-of-factly, and perhaps hubristically, states that he outstudied his fellow pupils, devoting days and nights to the development of his medical acumen. He quotes the texts of his medical predecessors throughout his work, often to point out their flaws. Above all, he draws on the Hippocratic corpus, celebrating Hippocrates as the ideal and foundational physician. Galen's own theories of physiology and medical practice drew heavily on the Hippocratic corpus, even as he presented his own modifications of it. Indeed, as the teenage Galen was reading and studying the works of his predecessors, he was also composing his own texts. He wrote 3 books during his early period of medical study in Pergamum: a description of the anatomy of the uterus, which survives in Greek, a treatise on eye diseases, surviving in fragments in Arabic, and a description of a debate between empiricist and Hippocratic physicians, surviving in Arabic. After Nikon died, when Galen was 18 or 19, Galen set out on his decade-long educational journey around the Mediterranean before eventually returning to Pergamum in 157 CE. A highlight of Galen's travels involved a prolonged stay in Alexandria, which had for centuries been recognized as a center of medical learning. It was here, from the late 300s BCE to the mid-200s BCE, that physician-scientists Herophilus and Erasistratus had undertaken groundbreaking dissections of human cadavers, radically changing existing assumptions about the human body and inspiring increased emphasis on the value of anatomy in medical training. Although systematic dissections on human cadavers would not occur again until the late Renaissance, the new knowledge generated through Herophilus's and Erasistratus's activities made Galen, among others, a strong proponent of the value of anatomy in medical training and continuing education. Galen would, throughout his life, and often in public, dissect pigs, primates, sheep, and goats to further refine his anatomical knowledge and to demonstrate his medical and technical skills. He never dissected humans, but in both his training and his medical practice, he explicitly took the opportunity to note the internal human anatomy he encountered when treating traumatic injuries and conducting surgeries. Back in Pergamum in 157 CE, Galen served as the physician for the professional gladiators who fought in ceremonial games honoring the Roman imperial cult, a role that might find its rough modern equivalent in being the team physician or head orthopedist for a top-notch basketball or football team. The analogy is only an approximate one, however. He secured this role in a grisly public display of his prowess in front of the chief priest responsible for selecting the gladiator's physician. Galen cut open the abdomen of a monkey and challenged his competitors for the position to replace its entrails and close the wound. When these other candidates did nothing, as Galen tells us, he took up his own challenge. thereby securing the prestigious position he sought. He would not have disappointed the chief priest who selected him for the role. He tells us that only 2 gladiators died during his first year on the job. He also notes that none of them died during the remaining 4 years of his tenure. His predecessor, Galen points out, failed to save 16 of these well-trained and expensive athletes. In addition to treating serious traumatic injuries, he was responsible for overseeing more mundane aspects of their health, such as their diet. Given Galen's ambitions and agonistic spirit, it is not surprising that he made his way to Rome in 162 CE, where his talents were noticed by social elites and prominent government officials when he successfully treated one of their mutual friends shortly after his arrival. Galen was invited to give public demonstrations of his prowess, including dissections of animals, and to treat wealthy and powerful Romans and their families. A parallel might be drawn to modern concierge medicine. Galen was, by his own account at least, an in-demand physician, and a supremely talented and successful surgeon in particular. This first stay in Rome was relatively short, as Galen departed in 166 CE. He writes that he was driven out by jealous rivals, but it is also likely that the outbreak of plague in Asia Minor may have prompted him to want to return home to help. He sailed from Rome back to Pergamum, picking up plants and minerals for therapeutic use en route. But the 39-year-old Galen was called back to Italy in 168 CE by none other than the Roman emperor himself, who required his services while on a military campaign against the Germanic tribes who were making their way to northern Italy. Galen departed Pergamum, and after arriving in Aquileia, the staging ground for the Roman army near the modern border of Italy and Slovenia, he found himself face to face with the plague, possibly smallpox or another related virus. If Galen contracted the disease, he does not mention it in the sources that we have. Susan Mattern offers the intriguing suggestion that Galen's experiences dissecting and vivisecting animals may have inoculated him against the disease through exposure to a related pox virus, much in the way that English physician Edward Jenner of the late 18th and early 19th centuries used effluvia of cowpox pustules to vaccinate. Vacca is, of course, Latin for cow. His patients against smallpox. Back in Rome in 169 CE, and treating wealthy and well-connected patients as he had done previously, Galen was asked by the Emperor Marcus Aurelius to sit out with the army again. A dream from Asclepios advised against this, Galen told the pious Marcus Aurelius, who permitted Galen to remain in Rome to oversee the production of the drug Theriac and to serve as a court physician to his son Commodus. This period was an immensely productive one for Galen, who wrote many of his most comprehensive works during this time. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180, however, a period of disruption ensued. Many of Galen's friends lost their lives and property in the subsequent civil strife. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Galen's own life came in 192 CE, when an enormous fire destroyed the Temple of Peace and its environs, including much of the Palatine Hill. This wealthy area of Rome contained well-appointed homes, extensive library collections, and, sadly for Galen, storehouses where he kept his irreplaceable manuscripts, plants, and minerals from his decades of travel, and even bespoke surgical instruments made from especially high-quality metal. An excerpt of the text Galen composed to tell an old friend how he coped with such a loss, avoiding distress, is included in this volume. Less is known about the later decades of Galen's life. It seems that after the assassination of Commodus in 192 CE, Galen continued to practice, to teach and to write, with a focus on recomposing texts lost in the fire or trying to obtain copies of versions he had previously shared with.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?